Your assignment for tomorrow is to go back to the mural book at Google Classroom and do lesson 8. Lesson 8 is about Islam, which is our next topic of discussion. The rise of Islam. We begin the study of Islam in the land of Arabia. Arabia, in ancient times up to the present time, is largely a wilderness. It's in relative isolation until the birth of Islam in the 7th century. Then more people begin living in Arabia. But until that time, hardly anybody lived there, just passing through. Arabs trace their ancestry back to Abraham through Ishmael. Are you familiar with Ishmael? You should be. You read it when you read through the book of Genesis earlier in the year. Ishmael was the first son of Abraham. Why wasn't he considered the son of the promise? John?
Because didn't he have sexual relations with one of his servants?
Who's he?
Abraham.
Right, Abraham had sexual relations with his wife's maidservant. Anybody remember her name? Her name is Hagar. She's pictured here. And this is her son Ishmael when they were mistreated by Sarah and escaped or ran out into the wilderness. Now Ishmael also received a promise of blessing from the Lord. In fact, the angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar and told her that not to fear because her son would be blessed also. It's just that he's not the promised child of blessing from Abraham, through whom the world would be blessed. So the Arabs correctly traced their ancestry back to Ishmael and then Abraham. We'll see what they do to change things a little bit later. The Arabs were divided among many tribes. They had no organized government or common religion prior to Islam. They just worshipped a bunch of different gods, and warfare was frequent, which is something that God foretold concerning Ishmael. It said he'd be like a wild donkey, and his descendants would be wild donkeys. So just really cantankerous, hard to get along with. Now, one of the things that the Muslims do concerning Abraham is that all the things that happened with Isaac, they say it really was Ishmael. So when Abraham offered his son Isaac, you remember what happened there? They say it was Ishmael that Abraham was offering. And so they turn it around so that they are the descendants of Abraham and the descendants of promise. They're the ones that are to be blessed by God, not the descendants of Isaac, which are primarily the Hebrew people. There were two distinct lifestyles among the Arabs. First, they were nomads called Bedouins. You ever heard the word Bedouin before? Right here, Bedouin. A Bedouin is a nomad. What was a nomad? You know that word, I think, don't you? What's a nomad?
Someone who walks alone, sort of. They travel.
Travel. Somebody who wanders.
Yeah.
In other words, they don't have a permanent dwelling place. They just wander. And when you see what they are doing, you understand that because they are largely sheep herders, goat herders, and you don't stay in one place because when sheep or goats eat grass, they eat it all the way down to the root, and you don't have any more. So you can't stay in one spot. You got to keep moving. And so that's what the Arabs were. They were nomadic herders of sheep, goats, and camels, or they were called Bedouins. Now, in addition, there were some Arabs who were city dwellers. And as such, they lived along important trade routes or along the coast. So they would build up a city along a trade route because they could make money off of trade. All right, so two different lifestyles for the Arab people back throughout most of the centuries until the time of Muhammad. All right, next let's look at the founding of Islam, and that comes through a man by the name of Muhammad, or Mohammed, sometimes spelled with an O. You might see it spelled differently. Muhammad, you've all heard of him. I am certain. If you haven't, you have been living in a cave. Muhammad, his name means highly praised. He lived from 570 to 632. He was born into humble surroundings in the city of Mecca. He was orphaned at the age of 6, and he became a camel driver. Totally uneducated, could not read or write. He became a camel driver at the age of 6, and through that, through driving camels, going from place to place, selling camels, being involved in trade, he came into contact with Judaism and Christianity. He accompanied his uncle on trips to Syria and Palestine. And so he came to hear about these different religions, and particularly Judaism and Christianity stood out because they both believed in one God. They were monotheistic. And that impressed him because most often he encountered polytheism among the Arabic people with whom he lived. Well, when he was a little bit older, he came to work for a rich widow who was 15 years older than he, and he eventually married her when he turned 25. So he was 25, that made her what?
40.
Yeah. And because she was wealthy, he was then freed up to pursue a life of meditation. He could take his leisure, he could think about things, he didn't have to go out and herd goats and things like that anymore, or camels. All right, so about 15 years later, when he's at the age of 40, he claimed to have received a vision in which the angel Gabriel gave him a divine revelation. It's pictured here. Here's the angel Gabriel appearing to Muhammad. This was the first of a series of visions and revelations that continued throughout his life. He became convinced that he was the messenger of God, entrusted with a new revelation for man. And he began preaching that there was only one God, but he didn't call him Elohim or Jesus. He said the one God's name was Allah, A-L-L-A-H. Allah was the major deity of the polytheistic system of the Arabs. So this was not a different God that he knew. This was the major God of the many gods, but he said he's the only one. All the other gods do not exist, only the one, Allah. And that he, Muhammad, was Allah's prophet. By the way, Allah was the moon god. Have you ever seen symbols of Islam? There's a crescent moon. That's where that comes from. Allah is the moon god. Well, his family and his friends converted to this new faith of Muhammad, but most people of Mecca ridiculed him, viewing his teaching as a threat to the city's commercial interests. Well, why was that? Well, Mecca was a leading trade center and a center of religious worship, with a sacred shrine called the Kaaba, which is pictured here. So in Mecca, there was this building, a square building called the Kaaba, and inside were hundreds of pagan idols. And so people would come from miles around to come see and worship these different idols. And the people of Mecca, the merchants of Mecca, were afraid that if Muhammad's one God idea caught on, that people wouldn't come there anymore, and they wouldn't be making any money off of it. similar to what happened to the Apostle Paul in Ephesus. Alexander the silversmith there got upset because Paul was preaching that there was a god that was different than Diana or Artemis. And that's where the Ephesian silversmiths made their money, was people buying copies of Artemis. So these merchants had the same problem. The shrine there attracted pilgrims from whom the merchants gained financially. Now, the principal attraction inside this Kaaba was the famous black stone. This black stone was a meteorite built into the wall of the Kaaba. According to later Muslim tradition, the angel Gabriel sent the stone to Abraham, who, along with his son Ishmael, built the shrine. Now, none of that's true, but that's the legend that they come down. And before Muhammad, they didn't have the legend of Abraham. It was just this meteorite that came. And so in ancient times, if you saw something falling out of the sky, you paid attention to it. You know, you thought that was something special. And so this black stone was inside the Kaaba and remains there. The followers of Muhammad just changed the narrative as to where it came from and what it meant. Well, most of the people in Mecca mocked Muhammad, saw him as a threat to the religious and commercial order of Mecca. And of course, the Kaaba being a central feature of that city, they were afraid that they were going to lose financially. So because of the persecution Muhammad was receiving in Mecca, he and his followers decided to flee to another city called Medina. So here's Mecca. They fled up to Medina. This move or flight from one city to the other became known as the Hijra, or flight is what that word means. It becomes a very important part of the Muslim tradition. In fact, the Muslims claim that this is year one. They measure their years after this. This is their first year in their calendar, is when Muhammad fled to Hijra. It is considered the beginning of Islam as a public religion. Well, his following grew rapidly there, and he was made the political and military leader as well as the spiritual leader. And so he gathered an army of militant Muslim followers and advanced his cause by military conquest. And so eventually he comes back down to Mecca with an army and conquers Mecca in 630, went into the Kaaba, destroyed the idols that were there, and was able to conquer the remainder of Arabia by the end of the year. Beginning in 632, Muhammad began to conquer outside of Arabia. In poor health, he finally made it back to Medina, where he died on June 8, 632, in the embrace of Aisha, his favorite wife. So that's, in brief, the life of Muhammad. Now, tomorrow we'll begin looking at the teachings of Islam. What do Muslims believe? Any questions?